Welcome to this video cast from Newcastle Business School. Today we're talking about employee reward. And particularly we're talking about the strategic reward policy of internal alignment. Internal alignment is a very important set of tools which allows the organisation to start to think about how to achieve its strategic reward objectives by putting in place an effective hierarchy within its workforce to determine who are the most valuable, who are the least value in the organisation. Now this is a very important first step to take in designing and establishing an effective employee reward system. So today what we're going to talk about are the various elements concerned with strategic alignment. First question concerns us is why we need to do this in the first place. Why do we need a hierarchy? Why do we need a pay structure? We're also going to think about what the key influences are upon the shape of the structure. Sometimes we have a lot of choice in the design elements of a strategic reward set of tools like this. Sometimes we're relatively constrained. So we need to think about what those influences are upon the decisions that we make and how they affect the choices that we make in strategic pay structure design. Then we're going to consider the various approaches that organisations might take towards alignment. The most common and the most traditional approach that organisations have taken have based alignment decisions around the jobs that people do in the organisation, and that makes sense because for most organisations the fundamental unit of the organisation is the job. That's how organisations break themselves down. That's how they organise themselves. So if they're putting together a hierarchy, if they're starting to put together a pay structure, then it makes sense to think about a job-based scheme. And many organisations over the years have gone down this particular route to good effect. So we'll think about job-based approaches. Now, the key tool in job-based approaches is job evaluation. This is the key technique that organisations have made use of. And this is basically a mechanism to evaluate the relative worth of jobs to determine which is the most important, the most valuable, the most complex, the most onerous, whatever job, and which is the least, and how do all of the other jobs fit in between. So we'll think about job evaluation, and we'll think about various job evaluation methods that organisations have used, because it's not all the same, and there are various methodologies that organisations might adopt in relation to this. Now, these various methodologies are not all the same, and they're not all of the same quality. And so we're going to think about broad types of job evaluation methods, to think about how they work and to think about their benefits and their disadvantages. And three main types of job evaluation methods that we'll look at are job ranking schemes, job classification schemes, and points rating schemes. And we'll think about those in some detail in a little while. The other approach to alignment, the other approach to building a pay structure that organisations might make use of are person-based approaches. Now, despite the fact that job-based processes, job-based approaches to alignment have been dominant for many years, they've also been criticised. And they've been criticised primarily on the basis that a job-based approach simply effectively rewards somebody ultimately for doing the things that the organisation tells them to do. It doesn't really reward people for making the full use of their talents, for making the full use of their capabilities. The people that we have in our organisations may be much more skilled, might have a much greater range of competencies in their armoury, but they never get a chance to use them because the jobs that we design for them and that we reward them for don't require them to do that, and actively prevent them from from making use of their full range of skills or competences. So person-based schemes try to look at not what somebody produces necessarily in the organisation, which might be constrained by the systems and structures that we put in place as management, but moreover, look at what people are capable of, what they bring to the organisation. So there are these two broad approaches that we see, job-based and person-based approaches. Within person-based approaches, there are also distinctions as well. Some schemes focus on what they call skills, and some focus on what they call competences. Now, there's a great deal of confusion about what the actual difference between skills and competences actually are, and some of the differences that we often see written about are entirely spurious, and so we'll have a little look at how we might distinguish skills and competences in a way that makes sense, and consider whether it actually makes any difference what it is that we call them. Once we've figured out what it is we're talking about, we'll have a look at how skill and competence-based pay structures might work, and also what we need to be careful about in the design and operation of skill and competence-based pay structures, because despite the fact that they've been designed to overcome various weaknesses in job-based approaches, they don't come problem-free themselves. So we need to be wary about various elements and to think about how we might minimize them, or whether we want to use these approaches in themselves. We might also want to think about whether there are various conditions, various types of organizations, various situations that organizations might find themselves in, various competitive scenarios, certain types of context, where these types of approaches might be particularly well suited. And so we'll have to think about how we might go about matching this kind of strategic choice to a particular environment that an organisation finds itself in, or that relate to a particular strategy that the organisation is trying to employ. So that's the main aim for today. There's quite a lot to think about, starting from very basic questions about why we need a pay structure, going through to how we actually do it, and the detailed methodological choices that we have in putting these things into place. So we'll start out with this core question, which is about why we need a pay structure in the first place. What kind of requirements does this stem from? What are the pressures? What is the reason for why we want to put a pay structure in place in the first place? And as an illustration of this, we're going to go back quite a long way. We're going to go back to a parable that was recorded in Matthew's Gospel in the Bible. And this is the parable of the vineyard owner. Now, in the parable, Jesus describes the kingdom of heaven to be like a householder who went out early in the morning to hire labourers for his vineyard. He agreed with those labourers a rate of pay for a day's work, a denarius a day, and off they go into the vineyard to start their day's work. Later on in the day, the householder sees that he requires more workers, sees others standing idle, and he says to them, "Go you also into the vineyard, and I'll give you whatever is just." Later on, same thing happens. Same again at the 11th hour a day, almost at the end of the day's work. "Go you also into the vineyard." So at the end of the day's work, the owner said, "Call the labourers and pay them their wages, beginning from the last, even to the first." Now, when the first in their turn came, they also received their denarius. Everybody got the same amount of pay for the amount of work that they did in the vineyard, whether or not they'd spent the whole day there, or whether or not they'd come at the 11th hour and just done that very last part of the day's work. Now, at this point, the people who had been in there the full day began to murmur. They weren't too happy, began to murmur against the householder, and they said, These last have worked a single hour, and the house put them on a level with us who have borne the burden of the day's heat. Now the householder's response is, friend, I do thee no injustice. Take what is thine and go. Now the householder's argument is that he agreed with those labourers at the start of the day a denarius. That would be the rate of pay for the day, and they agreed that, and they were happy with that arrangement at that point. The problem is when they start to see what other people are getting paid for what they see as a much smaller level of work. They compare, they make a judgment, they think about the equity, the fairness of not just the rate of pay that they get, but the rate of pay that they get for what they've done compared to the rate of pay that others get for what they think they've done as well. Now, this parable indicates the importance of a pay structure. A pay structure allows us to compare. It allows us to make a judgment. It allows us to see what each other is getting in the organisation. Now, many organisations like to keep this kind of information hidden or secret, but people do compare anyway. The information gets out, and the benefit of a pay structure is that whether or not we want that information to come out or not, when it does get out, we have a process, we have a system, we have a mechanism and an argument where we can defend what everybody gets and why they get it and what they get it for. It allows us to respond to the murmuring, which isn't just, I do thee no injustice. It allows us to be clear about the comparison that we've made, about the value that we've placed upon the work that we're getting from everybody in the organisation. And so this is the basis of the argument for a pay structure. This is what we want to achieve. We want a hierarchy that's clear, that's defendable, that provides an argument, that protects us from murmuring and discontent within the workforce, which is rational and makes sense in relation to what we were trying to achieve as an organisation, and makes sense from the point of view of employees as well. So we start out with our desire for a pay structure for these reasons, to achieve this kind of rationale that I've just been talking about. But that's really just the starting point, because then we're faced with all kinds of different choices about how we construct a pay structure. The first question is, what is it that we're going to use as the basis for our hierarchy? Do we base our pay structure around people-based elements, skills, competences, the things that I talked about a little while ago, or do we use jobs as the basis for our system of alignment? Now, the choices that we make here depend upon various objectives. What kind of workflow are we trying to achieve? What kind of other cultural elements are we trying to put in place within the organisation? People or jobs? It's a fundamental question about how we want to build our pay structure. We also need to think about not just workflow issues, but also about perceptions of fairness. These are key criteria for how this very important strategic reward policy is going to be perceived. Will employees see it as fair to build a structure around jobs? And how are we going to make sure that once we've decided what the basis of our pay structure is, putting it in practice, implementing, designing the pay structure based on either people or jobs is actually going to be fair? What mechanisms are we going to put in place? What methodologies are we going to employ to make sure that fairness is embedded in this system? Now, we talked about in previous podcasts that fairness is fundamental to the design of reward systems, not for any kinds of kind of namby-pamby, wishy-washy types of reasons, but simply because this is the basis of our deal with employees. This is our transaction. This is the effort reward bargain. And if the reward part of the bargain is perceived as being unfair by employees, then that may well have an impact on the effort side of the bargain as well. So we need to, as far as we possibly can, make sure that our systems are fair and are seen as fair, whether we're basing it on people, whether we're basing it on jobs. We need to make sure that the structures meet the requirements of the people that they're actually aimed at. The final set of aims that we need to achieve through our pay structure is to make sure that the structure itself directs behaviour towards organisational goals. You know, this isn't just some kind of abstract game whereby we divide up the workforce in a kind of interesting way, in a way which seems the most fair. We have to balance that by making sure that the pay structure also encourages the kinds of behaviour that we want to see as an organisation. So we need to be very clear about what our organisational goals are and how our organisational goals are going to be translated into particular kinds of effort. Now, different types of organisation will have different types of requirements for different types of effort from employees. So if we're using our pay structure as the basis for determining the rewards that are available within the organisation, then we need to make sure that that pay structure reflects and guides people towards the kinds of behaviour that make the most movement towards the achievement of our strategic goals as an organisation. So, for example, we need to make sure that the pay structure reflects this set of priorities within an organisation. You know, whether that's like a university situation where there are various sources of value available to a university. You know, it might be research funds, it might be through effective management of taught programs, effective and attractive taught programs that bring students and income into the organisation. Now, the university needs to be very clear about what kinds of talents, what kinds of skills, what kinds of jobs are most important towards those particular aims, those particular organisational goals, and make sure that the pay structure rewards the kind of jobs or the kinds of skills or the kinds of competences that most help the organisation to achieve those kinds of objectives. So, make sure that the pay structure is attractive enough once you get into a kind of a senior research role, so that professors with high reputations and high levels of research output are sufficiently attracted to the organisation, or to make sure that people who design, administer and run, manage successful programs, that they are properly rewarded for their contribution to the achievement of organisational goals, and to make sure that all of the jobs and the value that's placed around all of the jobs in the organisation reflect their contribution towards important organisational goals. And to the extent that we get this right, the pay structure can provide an extremely powerful set of symbolic tools for the organisation that can direct employees' behaviour without them ever being really told this is what you have to do, without people being given clear directives. The pay structure directs people to do the things that we want them to do, because it sends them the message: this is what we value, this is what is going to get rewarded, these are the higher status jobs and the jobs that bring with it higher levels of rewards. And you can see your way to getting into those kinds of roles. You have to do this, you have to do that, you have to exhibit these kinds of behaviours. Provides a very clear, powerful set of symbolic tools just by being designed right in the first place in relation to the organisational goals that we've set. Now, we don't necessarily just have a free hand in the design of a pay structure. There are various sets of influences that will be brought to bear. upon the kind of pay structure that we come up with. Some of those will be external to the organisation, some of them will be internal to the organisation, but they're not all amenable to managerial fiat. Management can't just decide what to do for themselves. External factors, well, probably the most pertinent set of factors in relation to this will be the approach that government take towards these issues. Up until 10 years or so ago, we had no minimum wage structure in the UK. When that was introduced by the Labour government, then that took away a certain range of choices about the way that the pay structure would operate at the bottom end. It removed a range of options for very low paid members of staff. So the approach that organisations, that government take towards regulating issues around pay, whether that's minimum wage, whether that's equal pay, whether that's bonus schemes, whether that's executive pay, whether it's whatever, these factors will have a major influence on the decisions that we can make within the design of our pay structures. We might also face some constraints from the outside as well, particularly from, if our organisation is unionised, unions will have particular stances that they might take towards the design of a pay structure, whether it's going to be more or less hierarchical about the differentials that exist between different parts of the pay structure. Shareholders will have concerns about how executive pay schemes typically might operate. So all of these factors need to be considered. Pay structure is an important part of the structure of the organisation. It's not a minor set of management decisions. It's a major influence on the way that the organisation operates, and it's a major influence upon the structure of the organisation as a whole. And it becomes a major part of the political process within the organisation, with political with a big P facing influences from the outside, and political with a small p facing influences from various groups, various influences within the organisation as well. So once all of these things have been taken into consideration, what criteria we use, people or jobs, the aims of the organisation, what are we trying to achieve with our pay structure, the influences upon the shape of the pay structure itself, then we are left with three basic sets of decisions about how the pay structure is going to be set up and what kind of shape it's going to have. And these three choices are these. Firstly, how many levels should it have? Should it be fairly flat, with relatively simple structure, grouping people in the organisation, relatively big blocks with relatively few numbers of them, or should the pay structure be quite complex and hierarchical with lots of different divisions between the various groupings within the pay structure? And there are pros and cons to these approaches, which we'll look at not just in this podcast, but in subsequent podcasts, particularly in relation to competitiveness. So levels are important, as are the size of differentials between levels. Do we want to have relatively shallow increases from one part of the pay structure to another, or do we want to have quite sharp distinctions between the rewards that are available in one part of the pay structure and the next? We also need to think about the criteria that we use for placing people at particular points in the structure, as we've discussed up till now. So let's start at the beginning with the aims of a pay structure. A pay structure needs to meet certain objectives, and the key thing that a pay structure needs to achieve is to support the workflow. And the workflow is not necessarily a straightforward term. When we're talking about workflow, we're talking about the way in which we want people to work within the organisation, the way in which the efforts of our employees are combined in order to create, deliver the goods and services that the organisation is in the business of producing. So the point of this aim is to make sure that our pay structure doesn't get in the way of what it is that we want people to do. Probably the best example of how this can go wrong is to think about the period of the 1980s and the 1990s. One of the biggest and the most fashionable pay trends during that period was the development of individual performance-related pay schemes. And this was seen as a fantastic innovation. It allowed organisations to identify the contribution that individual employees made to the creation of wealth in the organisation, to distinguish one employee from another, not group everybody together just because of the jobs that they did or whatever, move away from more traditional and sometimes seen as more staid and ineffective incremental pay increase, pay progression systems. So you have individual performance-related pay schemes being adopted across the board by organisations. At the same time, organisations were wanting to develop team working in the way that they went about producing their goods and services. Kaizen and all of these kinds of Japanese initiatives were also becoming very popular. Now the problem is that you had these two kinds of innovations happening side by side but pulling in entirely different directions. You had this desire for team working, for cooperation, for people pulling together, for taking group responsibility for the way that work was done in the organisation. And at the same time you had organisations wanting to reward people as individuals. Now, research on the impact of individual performance-related pay is very clear that it tends to focus people's attention on what they do at the expense of their colleagues, and also tends to focus people's attention upon the things that they know are going to be appraised within their performance appraisal mechanisms. Teamwork pulls in entirely the opposite ways, about wanting to cooperate, about taking joint responsibility, all of these kinds of things. So when we're designing a pay structure, we need to make sure the aims of the pay structure, that the way that the pay structure works, the way that it's designed, is in line with the way that we want people to work. That we don't tell people we want them to work in one way and then reward them in a way that points them in a different direction. So we need to make sure that our pay structure works, that it supports the workflow. We need to make sure that it's fair to our employees. And there are two things that we can think about, two ways that we can think about fairness in this sense. The first is to think about something that's called procedural justice. Now, procedural justice is about thinking about how the system works. What are the processes involved? How did the structure come to be? How did we result? How did this result come about? Distributive justice is the other way that we think about fairness, and distributive justice is about the outcomes of the structure. So if we think about procedural and distributive justice, on the one hand, procedural justice is about the rules, the action to policies that put somebody at a certain place in the structure. Distributive justice is about what happens once they're at that point. What's the rate of pay that they get compared to somebody else? And employees might judge the fairness of a pay structure against either one or both of these mechanisms of thinking about fairness. Now, we tend to think, common sense would suggest that the primary measure of fairness might be about distributive justice, that all that people are really bothered about is what the outcome is. What is their level of pay that they end up with, having gone through all of this process of building a pay structure. That's all that people really care about. Strangely, the research suggests that actually employees tend to be quite sensitive to the processes of building a pay structure. So when we're going through a job evaluation process, when a pay structure is being changed, employees do pay particular attention to the procedures, the processes, and if they're happy about the processes, then they tend to be more likely to be happy about the outcomes as well. So we need to think very carefully, not just about the eventual outcome, but particularly about the procedures, because employees do pay attention to that and use that as a very important judgment in terms of thinking about how fair the pay structure actually is. The final aim of the pay structure is to make sure that we direct employees' behaviour towards organisational objectives. And the key issue to think about in terms of directing employees' behaviour in this way is in terms of the idea of a clear line of sight, that there is a clear and unambiguous relationship between the rewards that come from the pay structure and the objectives that we have about the way that we want people to behave, about how we want people to work in our organisation. If there's a clear line of sight, then it's more likely that employees will exhibit these types of behaviours, that they will do the things that we want them to do, the things that are consistent with our objectives. If the line of sight is blurred, if we've got a distinction between what we say we want from people and how we set up the pay structure in terms of putting rewards in people's path, if that's not clear, if it's ambiguous, if it's perhaps contradictory, then we make it much less likely that employees will exhibit the kinds of behaviours that will help us achieve our strategic objectives. So we need to be very clear. Identify that line of sight, make sure there aren't any barriers, make sure that there aren't any kinks or bends or U-turns between what we say we want from people and how we reward people within the organisation. It's very important that we do these kinds of things. Okay, so if those are our aims, what influences are going to come to bear upon us in terms of our ability to design the structure in the way that we would like? Well, the first one that I mentioned a minute ago is about government regulation. Now, government regulation effectively, certainly from a free market kind of standpoint, is generally seen as a bad thing. A liberal approach to economics wants the government out of there. They want to be left alone. They want the market to sort out these kinds of issues. Where governments do decide to intervene, it's often portrayed as bucking the market. Now, bucking the market, like I say, might be seen as a good thing or a bad thing, but it generally is seen as being necessary or important in order to protect vulnerable people in labour markets, in this case, to make sure that those groups which are vulnerable or those groups which have been historically disadvantaged are protected in some way, because society, represented by government, doesn't believe that the market will do a sufficiently good job of protecting those people and operating in a way which allows them to achieve the kinds of outcomes that others within the market are able to. And probably the best example of this is in terms of things like equal pay legislation for women. We know that well, even now, women earn significantly less than men, and part of that is to do with discrimination, part of that is to do with the position of women within the labour market compared to men, and so there is an argument for government to intervene and to protect women, certainly against direct or indirect discrimination in this way. It's less easy to do anything about the position of women in the labour market relative to men, but regulation can be brought to bear to make sure that employers aren't allowed to say, well, women are going to be paid this, whereas men are going to be paid that for the same job. It's also possible to think about regulating to prevent organisations from disproportionately valuing the work that women do less than the work that men tend to do. Women and men are in different jobs. Are they getting a fair crack of the whip in terms of how those jobs are valued in relative terms to one another? So government regulation is about protecting disadvantaged groups. It might also be about minimum wages and those kinds of things. So the decisions about whether or not to regulate in this way is determined by government philosophy, whether the government has a broadly corporatist philosophy, that the market requires checks and balances to protect people, that there's a very clear recognition that the market is imperfect, and so it needs some management, it needs some tweaks, it needs some constraints, or whether you're from a liberal persuasion where control of markets is a threat to freedom. It constrains people's ability to make choices for themselves, businesses to make choices for themselves, individuals to make choices for themselves, and that when government gets involved in market regulation like this, it's not just a threat to liberty but also a threat to prosperity as well. And so your judgment about government regulation, depends where you lie on that kind of persuasion. Other influences on the issues of the design of pay structure are from organisational stakeholders, and principal stakeholders that we might think about here are trade unions on the one hand and shareholders on the other, and they have very different types of concerns. Unions historically have emphasised the importance of equity, of fairness within pay structures. Now, organisations tend to want to get as much bang for their buck as possible. That if they see high levels of performance going on or certain types of behaviours that particularly suits their needs at one point in time, then they want to be able to kind of incentivise that and encourage that quickly in a kind of nimble, flexible sort of way. For unions, issues of justice and fairness come first, because obviously their interests are about the interests of the workforce, and that comes first before the kinds of quick decisions that might serve the competitive interests of the organisation. They might not always quite line up with each other in the short term, and so they tend to emphasise equity, fairness, to make sure that people are properly rewarded and that the policy, the procedures reward people fairly as well. Unions also tend to have a preference for job-based schemes rather than person-based schemes. And again, this comes back to this emphasis on equity. Job-based schemes are typically easier to justify in procedural terms because we can identify the elements that are part of a job in very clear terms. We design that in terms of job descriptions as a matter of course anyway. And so it becomes a more straightforward affair to categorise and classify jobs against each other and to balance their relative weight, their relative worth, their relative value against each other than it is with person-based schemes. As we'll come to talk about later on in this session, person-based schemes are typically much more difficult to measure than job-based schemes. With person-based schemes, we're talking about skills, competences. They're less easy to define. They're less easy to identify whether that skill or that competence is present or not in a particular individual. They're much less robust in procedural terms, certainly from the point of view of equity, than job-based schemes might be. And so unions with that emphasis on equity tend to focus on job-based schemes rather than person-based schemes as well. So if unions are strong in our organisation, then it's likely that they're going to be pushing for a job-based approach rather than a person-based approach. In terms of progression through pay structures, how an individual moves up the pay structure to get pay increases and so on, unions historically tend to favour seniority based progression, that the longer somebody stays with the organisation, the more experience they've got in the job, the greater loyalty they show, commitment to the organisation, then that should be the basis of their progression. Organisations might want to do things differently. They might want to say, well, yeah, this person has been around a long time, but they don't perform very well, whereas this person's just joined and they're brilliant. And we want to provide some incentive for this person to stay with us, for this person to continue to be motivated, and we want to use a performance-based progression. Unions tend not to be very comfortable with that, and that tends to be the case for two reasons. Firstly, it's kind of cynical. Union membership tends to be concentrated amongst longer serving employees, and so having a seniority-based progression pay structure differentially benefits the bulk of their membership, their core constituency, if you like. The second reason is more based on principle and on concerns about justice, and that is that a seniority-based progression scheme is again simple, unambiguous. It's easily measured. We know how long somebody's been in the organisation, and so there's no question that if this person has been here another year, then they go up another point in the pay structure. Whereas questions about performance is very much a subjective judgment. And so it leaves it open to a degree of ambiguity. It leaves employees potentially vulnerable to the decision of an individual line manager. And so if one employee doesn't get on with one line manager, they may get a very poor appraisal, not because they're a poor employee, but simply because the manager hasn't given them a good appraisal. And that might not be seen as just. It's not fair. And so because of this concern with equity above all else, then that would be regarded as a threat, a problem from the point of view of the unions. In terms of the shape of pay structures, unions tend to prefer a flatter structure, that there's not so much difference between people at the bottom end of the structure and those at the top, that the differentials between each part of the pay structure are not so great. There are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, because unions traditions are based around collectivism. They're based around the idea that unity is strength, and so they want the workforce to see itself as a group, as a team, and so they want to avoid the kinds of structures which divide people, and big differentials between parts of the pay structure divide people more than small differentials between different parts of the pay structure. The barriers from one part of a pay structure to another become more apparent if that barrier goes along with a huge pay differential as well. The second reason why unions favour flatter structures is because flatter structures tend to benefit people at the bottom end of the pay structure rather than people at the top end of the pay structure. And the low paid workforce have been a traditional concern of unions to bring up the standard of living of people at the very bottom. And for many unions, particularly the general unions, their core constituency for 100 years has been people in those kinds of job categories, relatively low scale employees who may have been seen as getting a poor deal from their employment, and so doing something to improve their lot requires maybe a rebalancing of organisational resources away from people at the top end. Now, of course, that may provide a particular challenge to employees who, whilst they may not be immune to the problems of low pay, their emphasis might be upon employees that they see as providing most value to the organisation, the most highly skilled, the creative employees, the people who make a real difference to the kinds of services and goods that they produce. And they may want to do precisely the opposite to the unions. They may want to emphasise the rewards at the top end of their structure to make sure that they're attractive to the kind of people that they think are going to make a difference to the organisation in private markets, and so this may be a source of conflict in terms of decisions on pay structure design. From the point of view of shareholders, shareholders tend to not take too much of an interest in the broad shape of pay structures, but they are very much often concerned with executive pay. Executive pay has often been controversial, and the concerns of shareholders in relation to executive pay are not necessarily about overall level, but more particularly about whether the approach that an organisation towards executive pay improves organisational performance and share value performance, naturally, from that point of view. Now, often these kinds of decisions are concerned with things that are outside of the bulk of the pay structure. Executive pay levels are often, considered individually or certainly outside of the general structure that applies to most employees in the organisation. And so these concerns may not affect us too much in our considerations here. The final set of influences from the outside on pay structure are to do with the national culture that an organisation finds itself to be operating within. Now, we know from our understanding of various cultures around the world that there are very different perceptions about what is fair. One type of society may regard fairness in terms of equity. One type of culture might regard fairness in terms of equality. One type of culture might emphasize issues of rewarding performance, whereas others might take a very different kind of criteria. So fairness, how it's considered, how it's understood, will differ from culture to culture. Now, this means that organisations need to be sensitive to the kind of environment that they're operating in, and what works in one part of their organisation in one country may not work in another part of the organisation in a different country. And so organisations need to think about these issues of fairness and how that translates into questions of how people should be rewarded and what people should be rewarded for. Now, traditionally, even where organisations have operated as multinational corporations, and they might have taken due account of these differences between the various places where they operate, that can be managed. A more difficult kind of judgment comes where organisations have to deal with a workforce which is quite diverse. Now, in many countries where organisations operate now, we're not dealing with a single culture. We're dealing with a multicultural workforce, a multicultural environment, and so therefore a variety of different influences upon how fairness is perceived within a pay structure. Now, organisations might typically and traditionally have responded to fairness perceptions of the dominant culture, but where does that leave people in the organisation who don't share those assumptions about fairness, about how people should be rewarded? How should organisations respond to that? That's a challenge. Some might say that organisations will respond to that through flexible benefit schemes and other kinds of cafeteria types of approaches. But those tend to be limited to very constrained parts of the pay package as a whole, and it tends not to have been dealt with in terms of the design of the pay structure itself, a fundamental structure of the reward system. And this is an issue that organisations are still to resolve. There are other influences on pay structures, some of which come from the organisation itself. Now, organisations seek to employ particular strategies. They seek to develop certain levels and types of human capital. Now, these should have a very important influence upon the design of a pay structure. Organisations would be making a mistake to simply build a pay structure around some kind of generic approach or some kind of off-the-peg scheme without taking due regard of what it is that they're trying to achieve as an organisation. What kind of skills do the organisation need? What kind of knowledge amongst its workforce does it require? What kind of attitudes are there that are going to contribute to the achievement of the organisation's strategic objectives? Given that the pay structure can play such an important symbolic role in directing people's behaviour in this way, then it's very important that organisations have a clear idea about what it is that they want to achieve as an organisation. What skills, what knowledge, what attitudes do they want from their workforce? And simply to take account of that and to think, well, those skills, that knowledge, those attitudes that contribute most to the success of the organisation should be those elements that are most prominent within the pay structure. It's not rocket science. If we want people to do certain things, to exhibit certain characteristics, then we need to make those kinds of attributes the most attractive in terms of the rewards that they're likely to attract. Organisations also need to think about the design of work because the pay structure, whilst being an important element of how an organisation structures itself, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. Just as we've seen, it's subject to pressures from the outside, from government, from unions and so on. It's also subject to pressures from the nature of the organisation itself. So the nature of work technology, technologies that are employed in the way that work is done in the organisation, the structure of the organisation itself, the design of work, all of these are hugely significant in the design of pay structures. For example, it's unlikely that an organisation which was extremely complex in its structure, say a large public sector organisation, a hospital, a local authority, which might have tens of thousands of employees organised in maybe hundreds of different jobs in various departments, maybe in a whole variety of different geographic locations. It's highly unlikely that an organisation that's got that kind of complexity of structure is going to be able to put in place a pay structure which is extremely simple without compromising all kinds of internal expectations and internal understandings about how the organisation functions and how it all fits together. The nature of a pay structure does have an influence on how an organisation works, but it also reflects the way that the organisation is as well. So if you've got a complex organisational structure, then it will probably need to be reflected to some extent in the design of a pay structure as well. We also need to think about how work is designed. This comes back to issues of workflow to a large degree. How is it that we want people to work together? How do people work together? Who cooperates with who? Who interacts with who has nothing at all to do with whoever else? These things need to be taken into consideration. A pay structure isn't just kind of a dry, a theoretical exercise. It's about making sense of the way that the organisation actually operates and putting in place systems and structures which encourage the most effective way that people can be encouraged to work together. So we need to look at how work takes place, how work is designed in the organisation, reflect those issues in the design of the pay structure as well. So there are lots of influences, ranging from government, stakeholders, the nature of the market, the nature of workflow, nature of strategy, nature of work design, all of these issues. And these push and pull at management when they're putting together a design of a pay structure. They may not all be lined up nice and neatly pointing in the same direction. The likelihood is that these forces will often oppose each other. Some influences will favour the status quo, some influences will favour change. Now, because the pay structure is such an important part of the way that an organisation structures itself, an organisation that makes a decision to put significant change in place in the pay structure may have to really face some significant threat in order to make it seem worthwhile to go ahead with these kinds of changes, because there's this kind of to and froing, so much different kinds of pressures that operate upon the organisation. For an organisation to really make a step change in the way that a pay structure is going to work, may have to see a really important rationale for change. And that typically might be a significant competitive threat to the organisation. Unless we do something, then the organisation is going to face some severe challenges. So we need to be aware that this isn't something that happens regularly in organisations for these reasons. It's something that is often a kind of one in a generation type of change. And organisations will put up with the deficiencies in existing structures for quite a long time, because they know that it's such a big deal to change it substantially. So once we take account of those kinds of influences and the rationale that we might have for building a pay structure, there are some various choices that we need to make in its design. The first is about how many levels the pay structure should have, and this question basically comes down to whether or not the organisation should put in place a hierarchical or an egalitarian structure. A hierarchical pay structure will have lots and lots of different levels, dividing the workforce up in many different groupings and rewarding them differentially, seeing them as quite different to each other. An egalitarian structure will be much flatter. There'll be many fewer distinctions, splitting up the workforce. Now, like I said a moment ago, pay structures don't always have a free hand in this. If an organisation is very, very complex, then it's likely that the pay structure will have a degree of complexity to reflect that. Having said that, it may also be the case that an organisation that's wanting to change the complexity of itself, its organisational complexity, to reduce its complexity, to make it a simpler, more streamlined type of organisation, may benefit quite considerably by putting in place a pay structure which moves it towards a less hierarchical kind of system, because a pay structure can entrench undesirable organisational characteristics. If a pay structure is hierarchical, if it supports that division, that complexity, then it becomes much more difficult to make the organisation less complex. And so if we're using pay design as part of a change process, then we may need to be aware of where we want to get to and how we might want to use redesign of the pay structure to support change and to reinforce change in the organisational structure as a whole, to avoid the entrenchment of undesirable organisational characteristics, things that we want to get rid of. Second type of choice in terms of pay structure is about how big we want the differentials to be between the different levels within our pay structure. And there are certain issues that are particularly important in relation to differentials. The first is about pay levels that are right next to each other, adjacent pay levels. Now, these are particularly important because these are the kinds of points in a pay structure where people are likely to be working alongside each other. They're quite likely to have quite a lot to do with each other. We might require them to cooperate with each other, to work together. Now, if you've got a very large differential in terms of pay between one point in the pay system and the next, that might create problems in terms of our workflow arrangements. If we want people to cooperate, if we want people to take mutual responsibility for projects and so on, and yet we pay them quite different levels of pay, then that might create difficulties for that workflow. It might create a situation where people feel that they don't want to cooperate with this other person. That person's getting paid twice what I'm getting paid. Why should we cooperate? Why can't they take responsibility for the project? I'll just sit and watch. So, we need to be aware of differentials at this particular point because it have a very important impact, particularly on things like team working. Team working can also be another important issue for differentials because of the issue of the differences in pay between the team leader and the team members. And this is quite a subtle kind of distinction to make because the idea of a team is that you are all part of the team, even if you're a leader or just a member. But at the same time, the leader has to have a sufficiently different level of status in order to command authority. And so you're stuck with this kind of problematic distinction about making sure that the differential is big enough, but not too big, that it retains the team identity, but also enables that difference in status. The final area where differentials have typically been seen as important are the differences between the bottom and the top, but particularly between people at the very top and everybody else. Are executives paid enormous amounts more than everybody else? Does this create a problem in the culture of the organisation? Is it necessary to attract people at that level of the quality that's desired, or does it just create a bad dynamic within the organisation? So another kind of tricky question to answer in relation to differentials at that level, and also the general question about the difference between people at the very top and people at the very bottom. Can it be justified? Is it just seen as something that's immoral, something that creates ethical problems for the organisation? We also need to think about criteria to use in terms of choices, job-based or person-based. This is a fundamental question in terms of design, and we'll talk about this in some detail as we go through the podcast. We also need to think about tight or loose structures. Now, this is really a question, again, which comes down to issues of workflow and how we want people to behave within the organisation. We can design a pay structure which is very clearly defined, where we can identify exactly what it is that we want somebody to do and then reward them for doing just that. If we think about the kinds of job roles that people have at a place like McDonald's, where McDonald's have identified very clear work routines, very clear processes for how every single bit of the job is to be carried out. Now what that does is to create a very efficient workflow. Everybody knows that if an order for a particular kind of burger comes in, that this kind of patty is required, it goes on the hob for this many seconds, it's turned, then this happens, that happens. It's very kind of tight, efficient, kind of Fordist type of approach. And so if our emphasis, if our requirements are in terms of efficiency, then a tight structure will suit our purposes. What it doesn't do is to allow people any scope for expression, any scope to do the kinds of things that they might want to do or to be able to do. It doesn't allow somebody to do anything different to the things that we've already designed as an organisation. Now, if they're the priorities that we have, if we want people to experiment, if we want people to try new things, to develop new services, new ways of providing value to the market, to our customers, then we want creativity. And so our structures need to be based around a much looser understanding of what it is that we're rewarding, to allow people to express themselves, to have a much bigger box to play around in if we want to put them in a box at all. So our choices, depend upon what we want to do. If we want a very tight structure, then we want it for efficiency reasons, and so we locate somebody's position in the structure linked into very clear sets of criteria. If we want creativity, then we put somebody's place in the structure based on much looser criteria. And typically, it might be something around skills or competences that we're looking to reward because of their relevance for those kinds of objectives. So, choices that we have: levels, differentials, job-based or person-based criteria, tight or loose structures. So, we need to make some decisions about pay structures, and just to kind of summarise where we've got up to at this point, our choices can be characterised to a large degree between hierarchical choices and egalitarian choices. A hierarchical approach will have many levels within the structure. An egalitarian approach will have many fewer levels. People will be grouped in many less levels within the structure. In a hierarchical structure, the differentials between the levels will be relatively large, whilst in an egalitarian structure, the differentials will be relatively small. The criteria that we use, though, will be the same in each. We can use either a person-based or a job-based approach in either hierarchical or egalitarian types of structure. Now, why would we do these types of approaches? Why would we use a hierarchical or an egalitarian type of approach? Well, in a hierarchical type of pay structure, the kind of work organisation that we're trying to support is a relatively tight fit, egalitarian, loose fit. In a hierarchical approach, we're probably trying to encourage the performance of individuals within the workforce, whereas in an egalitarian approach, we're probably trying to encourage the activity and the cooperation of teams. Let's just explain that bit for a moment, because this is an important point to consider, and we'll think about this in a moment as to why these distinctions are so important. If you remember the example that I gave a while back about this contradiction between organisations putting in place an individual performance related pay scheme and the encouragement of teamwork in practices, we can see that we need to think about matching pay structures with the kinds of objectives that we've got. Now, organisations, for legitimate reasons, might want to encourage individuals to shine, to be stars, to seek promotion, and so on. And that might be the emphasis that they want to place upon how they design their pay systems, to encourage that kind of characteristic. Alternatively, other organisations might want to encourage teamworking, cooperation, and so on. Now, the type of pay structure that would be appropriate in these types of approaches are, on the one hand, for individual performance, a hierarchical approach, and on the other hand, for team-based approach, egalitarian. The reason for this is based around the idea of seeing the pay structures providing greater or fewer barriers to cooperation and the kinds of incentives that individuals get as against teams. Now, if you've got a hierarchical system, like we can see above, we've got many different levels, which means that the workforce are divided in many different parts of the pay structure. Now, that creates problems for the creation of effective teams across levels. And if we're trying to build a team, it's likely that we might cut across those levels, and there are all kinds of pay structure barriers that exist. There will also be problems caused by the size of differentials in a hierarchical system. Not only have we got many potential barriers for the construction of a team in a hierarchical system because of the numbers of levels, each one of those barriers is seen as significant because there are big differences in pay between everybody in those different levels. So if we want to encourage team working, we'd want an egalitarian system with fewer levels, therefore less chance of barriers existing between the members of the team. And that even if those barriers do exist, the barriers are not so significant because the differentials between levels of pay for each of the levels will be quite small. So an egalitarian approach reinforces, encourages the organisation of work in teams. From a hierarchical point of view, the idea of having many different levels and big differentials for each level encourages individual performance. It allows individuals or encourages individuals to seek promotion. They won't necessarily spend a lot of time in each level that they're at. They always have their attention drawn to the next job, the next level that's available, and they're incentivized to seek promotion because of the large differentials that exist between the job level that they're in now and the next job level. Big difference between each one, and so they're encouraged to seek those promotions. And so individuals are encouraged to stand out, to become visible, to provide the kinds of behaviours that allow them to find their way up that job and pay structure. So we can see, hierarchical and egalitarian approaches provide different types of answers for different types of work organisation. They also suit different types of fairness criteria. Hierarchical systems typically, because of their emphasis on individual performance, tend to reinforce the idea of performance as the basic measurement of performance. If people do well as individuals, if they perform well, then they get the benefits of the pay structure, and that those big differentials disproportionately reward people who perform well as against people who perform more poorly. From an egalitarian point of view, ideas about fairness are more to do with equal treatment. That fairness is about not too big gaps between people at one level and people at another level. Certainly not too big a gap between people at the bottom and people at the top. Different perceptions of what fairness actually means. One based in terms of performance measures, one based in equality-based measures. In terms of the kinds of behaviours that are encouraged, again, this fits with the kind of pattern that we're painting here. A hierarchical structure encourages behaviours that lead to promotion-seeking behaviour. It's about encouraging people to stand out and be visible and to perform as well as they possibly can as individuals. Hierarchical systems drive people towards those kinds of behaviours, whereas egalitarian systems pull people together in teams. They encourage cooperative types of behaviours. Now, if we think about the kinds of themes that we've been trying to develop in this session so far, about being clear about what our human capital requirements are, then we can see that the kinds of choices that we might make here in terms of pay structure will be very different depending on what kind of organisation we want to achieve, what kind of work organisation, what kind of fairness measures, what kinds of behaviours we want. And so the choices about pay structure are very significant here. Now, we can place these questions about hierarchy or egalitarianism in a more kind of theoretical sense here, because there are two theories that are pointing us in two different directions. Why do we think that these kinds of outcomes occur from these types of pay structures? Now, one way to think of this is to think about a pay structure as a kind of a prize structure. So if we imagine that we enter into a competition, the example that's often given is a golf tournament. And there are two potential golf tournaments that we can alter. In one, the picture at the top, there's a prize structure which adds up to a total purse of £100,000. But you only get any prize if you figure in the top three places in the competition, and the prizes are really quite attractive. 60,000 for winning, much less if we don't actually win. So only 25,000 for coming second, 15,000 for coming third. Second type of prize structure takes the same purse, £100,000, but it divides it much more equally around the competitors. So whereas in the first competition there were only prizes for the top 3, here there are prizes for the top 10 in the competition. The prizes though are much less generous. So if you win, in this case, you only get 19,000, which is only a little bit more for coming third in the other competition. The differences between the prizes in the competition are much less stark. Typically only 1,000 between each position within the competition. Now the question here is to think, well, which of these prize structures is more motivating? Now, what you think about this would probably depend upon your approach towards risk. It also depends upon where you think you're likely to come in the rankings in the competition. It also depends upon how we're likely to compete in any particular competition. Now, there is a theory that suggests that typically people will feel much more motivated towards the kind of prize structure that's available in the top example. That people see these enormous prizes that are made available and are motivated through trying to achieve those kinds of outcomes. Whereas they look at the kind of prize structure in the example in the bottom picture, and it doesn't really provide them with much incentive to break sweat in this kind of situation. And so tournament theory suggests that what we should be doing with our prize structures and by comparison our pay structures is to put in place these very high differentials to make the big rewards only available at the top and much less attractive rewards further down the pay scale, because that encourages people to aspire to compete more fiercely, to do those kinds of behaviours. Now, of course, the fundamental issue with this is, should this be applied generally across organisations? If tournament theory says that this kind of prize structure at the top is much more motivating, and we want people to be motivated at work, of course we do, because they work hard, higher performing and so on, why don't we just put in place these kinds of hierarchical systems as a rule? Now, of course, the counter to that is that work isn't always like a golf tournament. Firstly, and probably most importantly, people don't compete at work as individuals all the time. We don't always want them to compete as individuals. There's much more likelihood of cooperation in the kinds of pay structure that you see represented by the bottom picture than you do at the top. Yes, the top picture may provide much greater levels of motivation to perform as an individual, much less motivation to cooperate as a team, and sometimes that's what we want. And so it's important to remember that what we need to do is to match kinds of pay structure with the kinds of outcomes that we're trying to achieve as an organisation. There isn't some general catch-all theory that provides us with the answer for the achievement of the kind of objectives that we're after in relation to our pay structures. We have to think very carefully about what the organisation is like, how it wants our employees to be structured, how it wants them to behave, and how that's going to help us achieve our strategic objectives, and then match our kinds of pay structure outcomes to those kinds of objectives.